Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to connect you with Delegate Mark Keam this morning. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Woody.
You're in a different building, not a new one.
That's right.
Have you adjusted to your new quarters yet?
You know, it's going to take a whole session to get used to this building. Obviously, the rooms are at different places. We have floors where some stairs don't go to another floor. It's a little bit confusing, but you know what, the work goes on.
But your constituents know how to contact you, I believe.
Oh, they do. And I get a lot of emails still. I get lots of phone calls. I was pleasantly surprised to see so many constituents already stopping by.
A lot more transparency, at least formally. I know last year we started to see cameras in some committee rooms, but now that's par for the course.
Absolutely. We've always had cameras on the House floor. And now we have cameras in committees and subcommittees, and we have to remind ourselves that everything that we do, every vote we cast is being watched by our constituents, which is something I've been very big on transparency from the beginning, but I'm just glad that it's actually catching on, because every vote, every discussion that we have should be heard by everybody.
And of course, subcommittee votes are now recorded, as I understand it.
Yes, unless it's like an administrative vote, which doesn't really matter on the merits. Yeah, it does.
So have your committee assignments changed this session?
No, I was actually surprised that it didn't, because I serve on 4 committees and a bunch of subcommittees. I'd assumed just with the ratio of the election that resulted in 49 Democrats total, I just assumed that I'd have less committees so that other people can have more, but I guess somehow the numbers all worked out.
So how are things going along in your district so far?
Well, I think folks in my district are generally, doing well. Now, there's a lot more impact on their lives from what's happening in Washington, D.C. than what's happening in Richmond. And one of the things that we're very proud of as part of the Virginia General Assembly is that, unlike the federal government, we would never have shutdown. We would never have a budget impasse. We would never leave this town without actually passing a balanced budget under the Constitution. So to the extent that we see a lot of disruptions in people's lives, especially in my area where we have so many federal employees, my wife is one, federal workers and contractors and subcontractors, and all those businesses that work around the federal government, the small mom and pop sandwich shops, the laundromats, they're all impacted by what happens or doesn't happen in Washington. So to the extent that our folks, my constituents, are concerned, I think they're still concerned a lot more about how and why the Washington, D.C. Government isn't operating as well.
And a lot of that relates to the fact that we've got the Pentagon and I think almost close to 400 military installations in the state of Virginia.
Oh, absolutely. We are very proud of our military presence here. As you know, we have, I think we're the first as far as a population of women veterans in the country. We're 4th, I think, in terms of overall number of veterans as it relates to the civilian population. But we certainly do everything we can in the Commonwealth, both at the state level and the federal level, to ensure that our military presence, from the Marines to the Navy to all the other bases, of course, many Army bases, and the National Guard and Reserve, that we provide the best service we can for them.
So this impasse in Washington creates a lot of uncertainty. We do have another continuing resolution, at least until February 8th. However, all that uncertainty doesn't help at all.
Oh, it certainly doesn't. And it's a shame, because if you think about the fact that the General Assembly is meeting for 60 days, we started on January 10th, we'll be here till the middle of March. During that 60-day period, the federal government may have shut down twice, maybe 3 times. So that tells you the way the 2 systems are working in different ways. But yeah, that is, I really hope that our friends in Congress can work this out and certainly work with the president. And I do remember when Mr. Trump ran for president, one of his big things he touted was the fact that he was a negotiator, that he is an art of the deal. He's the one that can get things done. Well, so far, I haven't seen a lot of deals being made, especially with the bipartisan deals being made. So I'm hoping that this time they'll actually solve this problem.
And of course, you sit on the Finance Committee, and of course, this tax cut in Washington has a significant impact on what happens to our tax code, the revenues that are coming in. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. As a personal matter, I did not like the tax cut that happened at the federal level. I thought it was way towards the corporate and the higher income as opposed to some of the working folks that I represent and many of us in Virginia who are struggling to make ends meet. And that tax bill didn't do anything for that working class and middle class families. But one of the uncertainties that it created that's having a direct impact on us, and you alluded to the Finance Committee, I know the Appropriations Committee is also looking at this, and I serve on the Commerce Committee where we have some bills that impact this as well. But one of the biggest impacts is that given the reduction in the amount of the mortgage and the personal deductions that you can have, especially on the state and local taxes, that cap was reduced to a point where people that could qualify said, you know what, if I paid my taxes up front now, maybe I can save later. And so all of a sudden we had more tax filers coming into Virginia this year before the deadline than we ever thought. And so that created a little bit of an artificial surplus, if you will. But it creates uncertainty for us as policymakers because that's not money that we need to be able to say this is going to come in every year at the same way. It might be a one-time thing. On the corporate side, not so much on the income tax, personal income tax side, on the corporate side, it's created an interesting situation, which I actually have a legislation that I put in a couple of weeks ago on this. I'm working with the Attorney General's office on this because it's a very interesting problem that we're facing that we didn't anticipate. About 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was in 2015, our General Assembly passed a Senate bill, which so many people have heard about now. It's called Senate Bill 1349, or otherwise known as Dominion Energy's rate freeze. And the bargain that Dominion Energy wanted to strike was, given that President Obama was talking about this new clean power plan and making sure that we have a new way of dealing with energy, creating utilities and making sure that we reduce the carbon and emissions, when President Obama announced that, a lot of the electrical utilities said, you know what, this might create some uncertainties on our end, our businesses. We don't know how to comply with all these new federal regulations. So let's strike a bargain. We will freeze a rate for the taxpayers, the customers. We won't charge any more than what we're charging you now. In exchange, let us out from under all the regulations for a few years because we want to be able to save the money instead of coming back to the government and having to be reviewed and all the work that has to be done. Let's save all that money and time and use that money towards whatever we have to do to comply with the federal law. Well, guess what? The federal law never happened. President Obama is no longer in office. President Trump has pretty much overturned anything that President Obama has done. And as a result, we have an empty promise. Our state government has frozen the rate, whether it goes up or down, but the Dominion Power is out from under the regulatory regime. So we're trying to put them back under the regulations. But one of the things that came up as it relates to the corporate tax discussion that we're having is when that bill went through, they agreed to also not come back to the SEC for any types of tax differences. Well, President Trump just gave them a big tax break, $150 million or more. And if Dominion wants to collect that tax so that they can put that money back into their revenues, they need to come back to the SEC. And
that's the State Corporation Commission.
State Corporation Commission. So I have a bill that would allow them to come into the SEC for this narrow purpose of collecting the taxes so that that tax money can come back in and then be sent back out as refunds to our consumers. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we're going to have this year is dealing with the Dominion rate freeze.
I believe that has bipartisan support, does it not?
Well, it has bipartisan support, but it also has tremendous bipartisan opposition. And the reason why is, and I have nothing against Dominion Power as a company, and I know they're a good corporate citizen and they employ a lot of people, so I am a customer of theirs. But what I don't like is the fact that a lot of times you have these bills that come out, thick bills with dense language that we can't understand, very technical. It's all written by people on the lobbying world that know this stuff inside out. But regular folks like you and me, if you read this bill, you wouldn't understand what that does.
Right.
And so what Chairman Lee Ware and I and a few of us on the bipartisan side who are looking at this, a little bit skeptical to see what this bill does, we asked the State Corporation Commission to tell us what they believe this bill means to them in terms of the ratepayers and how much their taxes will be returned back to the customers. So we're waiting for some more fact-based evidence before we can move forward on the bill.
Right. Now you mentioned earlier the standard deduction. To what extent will the Virginia Code conform to the new federal law?
Well, we actually did pass one conformity bill so far, and for most Virginians, this is not something that you're going to even hear about because it's a very technical, very routine thing. Virginia is one of the half a dozen states or so that do not have our own tax system, meaning that we do have our own system, of course. What we do is we say anytime the federal government changes things, we'll just peg it to them so that whatever the federal government changes as far as their IRS codes, we will conform to what they do. So we have a vast majority of our laws that affect taxes conform to the federal government on a yearly basis. Usually the federal government does very little changes in tax law, so we don't have to conform too much. So as a matter of routine, the very first bill that we pass out of the General Assembly every single year with an emergency clause is a federal conformity bill. Nobody pays attention. It's very routine. This year, it's no longer routine. It's very unusual. So what we did so far was we passed a bill that conforms to the federal government as far as 2017 taxes are concerned.
I see.
Now, the President Trump's and the Republican tax bill that passed obviously affects 2018 going forward, but it did have some pieces that affected 2017, including health care, the deductibility for people that have out-of-pocket expenses. So that portion we passed this year, but we may have to come back and readdress depending on how the federal government changes their laws.
Now, there were a lot of changes here in the General Assembly, especially in the House of Delegates. Did you anticipate that the Democrats would pick up, what, 15 seats?
Well, Woody, I've been in and around politics for a long time, and I have a pretty decent sense and a pulse of how things go and the mood of the voters. I don't think any political pundit out there, any expert could have predicted that level of intensity of the voter turnout that we saw this past election. We expected, as a Democrat, I certainly expected we'd pick up several seats. On a good day, we thought we might hit double digits, but we didn't expect 15. And I'm glad for that. But I'm also glad that it shows it's not just about who won or who lost or how many seats Democrats pick up. To me, it was a real reflection on the fact that people out there are paying attention. People out there, regular folks, my neighbors and friends, are actually paying attention to what the government does on a daily basis, why it's important to have people in government that's going to do things for them and not for some special interest or some narrow group of people. And most importantly, I think, for better or for worse, President Trump and his rhetoric, especially about his policies, and some of the extreme language that's been used in Washington, D.C. over the last few months, I think that's really led to, especially women, but people of color and others feeling like this government at the national level doesn't represent me. It doesn't represent my values, and the direction that Washington is going with one-party control is not the direction that we want. And so they took it out on Virginia because we happen to be the next election after that. And so again, this year, the Democrats were the beneficiaries. And from a partisan perspective, I'm happy about that. But next year, it could be a different story. The year after, it could be a different story. Sure. I think what's important is that regardless of party, if you are a voter in Virginia, pay attention to what we do. And that's why what you're doing and what the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association is doing is so important, so that viewers out there watching Cox can understand, hey, this is what your government does. These are folks that are doing my work every single day.
Now, I guess the General Assembly will need to address some anomalies that occurred during the course of the election. We had the situation in the Hampton Roads area where the name was actually picked out of a bowl. We had a situation in Fredericksburg and Stafford County where people were assigned to the wrong precinct. I understand that's a statewide issue. What can the General Assembly do to address those situations?
We certainly have to do something. There's no question that the status quo is not acceptable. The issue with the recount that ended up with a tied vote, which then ended up with picking a number out of a hat situation, that obviously was traumatic to see that. It was on national news, and my good friend Shelley Simons ended up losing to incumbent delegate David Yancey. And I'm sure they're good people. They're both good people. Sure. They deserve to. They ran good campaigns, but just the way that it ended up in such a partisan way, where it became literally a toss of a coin, I think it led to a lot of disappointment on both sides. And to the extent that we can try to address that, anticipate that going forward, so that we don't end up with recounts where the numbers go back and forth. There were some allegations that one of the ballots that shouldn't have been counted under the code, based on the way we interpret the code, was counted, and the judges just ruled that that's what it was. And so that, I think, definitely needs to be looked at to ensure that the code language that we have already set in place is followed every single step all the way to the very end. As for the Fredericksburg, Stafford area and the split precincts, that's something that it is a problem, no question. The solution isn't as simple as we would like, and the reason is because it's not just right there. If you only took that precinct and said, okay, well, let's just make sure we redraw the lines, But there are many places in the Commonwealth where we have that split precinct situation. And for us to look at that on a wholesale level, we would have to do a statewide redistricting. But to do statewide redistricting, that brings in all the other factors about is it fair, is it partisan, do you have too many minorities in one place, all the issues that are litigated right now all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So because you can't just pull a small little thread and then unravel the entire situation, we're trying to be careful with it. I'm not sure exactly how we solve it, but we are all aware that before the next election, this particular technical problem has to be solved.
You know, it's not unlike trying to deal with the tax code in terms of preferences, for example. I know that's something you've been involved in as well, because it's like playing whack-a-mole. You take one preference away, someone's going to get hurt, someone's going to get helped. You mentioned the U.S. Supreme Court because there's some interesting cases pending there in terms of voting rights, in terms of redistricting issues, because before you know it, 2020 will be here when you're going to be involved in redistricting. Why are those court cases so important?
Well, Woody, you hit the nail right there on the head, because all of this, the most fundamental part of democracy is the ability for voters to be able to vote and choose a person that they want, and that person with a majority vote goes and represents them. Unfortunately, with the way redistricting has been done over the last few decades and continues to be done, it appears that a political party can decide the outcome of their election before voters even get to vote by drawing the lines in such a way that one person from one political party would have an easy way to get in, and the other person from the other party has no chance to get in, just the way they redraw the lines. That's been called gerrymandering, jerry-rigged. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that people talk about this issue, but what the reality is that the standards that we are using now, based on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as it's been interpreted over the years, and has also been repealed over the years, is not working. It's just not working. And we've seen politicians in both parties, frankly, politicians in both parties at the state legislature drawing lines in a way that benefits them based on party politics, but they call it based on minority status. Or they might use it based on, oh, we had to draw it this way because of all these trees and land and rivers, but the reality is, there's another way that they could have drawn it easily. So they use different terms that might be acceptable under the law to create a situation where partisan politics trumps everything else. I have a bill that I put in this year that would look at, among other factors, because my colleagues have many bills that deal with this too. I support any kind of a redistricting process, whether it's constitutional amendment, separate commission, anything that takes the politics out of it or the partisan politics out of it. And the bill that I put in would say, let's also look at, in addition to all the other factors that are objectivity standards, let's also look at how competitive a district is. Because regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, if the incumbent in, say, 20 years has never had a challenge from anybody, it tells you there's something going on in that district. I mean, either people are really happy, they don't care, or that there's just not even an opportunity for somebody to challenge that person because he or she is so dug in, and the party apparatus has created such a monopoly that regular voters don't get a say. So I have a bill that would look at that criteria of competitiveness. But overall, I think we do have to look at this, and we got to do it before 2020, because once the 2020 census numbers come out, and once we start the redistricting 2021, which is only 3 years from now, that's the last chance that we in Commonwealth will have for another 10 years to revisit these issues.
And of course, partisan politics is involved in one of the matters pending before the U.S. Supreme Court for the first time in decades. They're going to take up the issue of to what extent partisan politics is a valid consideration in terms of redistricting.
Yes, I'm very happy at the status right now in terms of the litigation, because the issues that we should be talking about are now before the right venues, and let's see what happens.
So how close are we to some type of bipartisan commission on redistricting, you think, in the General Assembly?
Well, I've been disappointed that year after year after year, these bills come up, I co-sponsor them, but they die, and they usually die in a partisan vote. The Senate has already voted down a bill which we thought was pretty good, bipartisan. Senator Janet Howell, Senator Jill Vogel came together, a bipartisan bill. That was already defeated. So, it tells you that, unfortunately, partisan politics is so intertwined with policy makings at times that it's hard to separate the two. And on redistricting, that seems to be the case.
So I guess it's important that as of 2020 or 2021, the Democrats are in the seat, so to speak, in terms of the majority here.
Well, it's an interesting perspective, Woody, because I think right now Virginia has sent us a bipartisan set of leadership. We have Democrats running governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general's offices, and then we have Republicans running the Senate and the House. So to the extent that between the executive and legislative branches we have bipartisan checks and balances, then I think that's a positive thing, because whatever the Republicans do in the House and Senate, if it's too extreme, then the governor can check it by vetoing and vice versa. But I also think that, and this isn't a partisan statement, I also think that it's helpful when you have one chamber or the other chamber be led by different political parties, so that you have some within the legislative process, before it even gets to the governor, you have some checks and balances there as well, so that every person in Virginia feels that their voice is heard, at least in one way or another, and they'll see why one political party stops a measure and vice versa. So I think checks and balances is always a good thing, and transparency, of course, is a key to all that.
Now, what about absentee voting? I think you have some legislation dealing
Yeah,
with
you know,
that.
it's interesting. I was sitting in the Privileges and Elections subcommittee the other day to present my bill, and unfortunately, again, all of my Democratic colleagues put in bills that I thought were all reasonable, get rid of all those excuses for why we can vote
Right.
in early.
Right.
All these reasonable bills all went down, unfortunately, in a party line vote, so they all lost. My bill surprisingly came out unanimous, and my bill would help voters, and it's simply put, what it does is, if you are a person who wants to vote in person on election day, you show up and you say, I'm John Smith, here's my ID card, they process your thing, and then you go in and you vote and you come out. There's no social security number involved whatsoever. You walk in, you show your ID, you vote, and you walk out. If you want to do the same thing as an absentee ballot by walking into your government center of 2 or 3 weeks before the election day, because you knew that on election day you're not going to be
Right,
there. You
right.
walk in, you show your ID, everything, and they'll say, well, put your social security number down on this piece of paper. Like, why would I do that? I'm here. If you think I'm not the person, tell me why this U.S. passport, U.S. citizenship,
Right,
my
right.
driver's license isn't good enough. Well, according to the code, that's what you have to do, because it's absentee ballot. Whether it's in person or by mail, you have to put your social security down. Well, I had a constituent who was really upset because she refused to give her social security number because, you know, ID theft and what have you. And the registrar told her, well, I'm sorry, ma'am, but you can't vote. So she was not allowed to vote because she refused to give her the last 4 numbers
Right.
of her social security down, and she thought that was wrong. And I looked at the code and I said, that can't be true. Read the code several times, and sure enough, it required it. And so we talked, and brought the bill, and there wasn't a single person, Republicans or Democrats, who said that makes sense. So we struck that language. So now I have a bill that would actually not require a person showing up in person to show their social security number, which then becomes possible concern for ID
Right.
fraud. So.
I also think, don't you have a constitutional amendment on the right to vote
Oh,
as
absolutely. People always say that voting is a fundamental right. I mean, you hear every single politician on both sides of the aisle declaring how voting is so fundamental, and yet it's not written anywhere in the U.S.
Exactly.
Constitution or in any state
Exactly.
constitution. If it's so fundamental, like the right to speech, right to press, right to assemble, right to bring your grievance to the government, right to do all these other things that we talk about, including right to bear arms and all the other issues that we talk about to be important fundamental rights, then certainly voting should rank in there. So I put in a bill that simply declares in Virginia it's a fundamental right, and that no state or local code or ordinance can trump the right to vote for somebody. That probably won't be heard this year because of the way that the sessions work. We take up constitutional amendments in the second part of the year, not the first part. So,
Now, you serve on agriculture as well. And as I understand it, agriculture and forestry brings a lot to the economy of the state of Virginia. Talk to us about that.
sure, Woody. If you live in my neighborhood in Northern Virginia near Tyson's area, where you have the tallest buildings and skyscrapers and concrete everywhere, you wouldn't think much about agriculture or forestry. But I want every Virginian to understand that the agriculture industry, coupled with the forestry industry, is not only the #1 industry in Virginia, has been since day one, it remains the #1 Virginia industry, but it's the #1 by far. The second, third, fourth ranking industries pale in comparison to the dollar amount of revenues and economic opportunities that agriculture brings in. And we're talking about not just farming, but also aquaculture, meaning all the seafood and the water-based industries in the Northern Neck and the Hampton Roads area. We also have tremendous forestry, and now with the energy and the renewable energy that comes from use of renewable sources, wind, solar, all that adds to the idea that Virginia is blessed with great natural resources. We have some amazing agriculture, but we also have to be safe and good about the way we treat our land and conserve our resources. So it's something that doesn't come to me naturally, because I've never lived my whole life, and I was born overseas, but as an immigrant who's lived in a few different places, I've never once lived in a place that had less than 1 million people. So when I travel to the rural side of Virginia, the southwest, south side, and I drive through hours and hours of our agricultural land, I have to remind myself that I'm the anomaly. Most people in Virginia live in that area, and so I need to learn, and I've been blessed to have learned a lot on the Agriculture Committee, and I really respect and enjoy the way we do things in Virginia as far as our supporting our agriculture and agribusinesses.
A lot of agritourism going on now, and
Yeah.
the wine industry is
Oh, yeah.
really booming as well.
Yeah, actually, it reminds me, I just co-sponsored a bill that I helped draft and move through the agriculture committee that for the first time now, if you're a pet owner, if you have a dog, and you want to visit a winery, you are prohibited from bringing the dog beyond the fences into the winery.
Oh, I see.
Now we're going to let you do that as long as the dog doesn't create any obvious health concerns with the food or anything like that. So if you're in the restaurant area, part of the winery, you can bring your pet dog in. So that's good news for
Oh,
Virginians.
great, great. A lot of export opportunities in terms of agriculture as well. Soy, corn, those kinds of things out of the Port of Virginia.
Oh, absolutely. I was born in Korea, and I can tell you that Korea ranks top 10, top 15 in terms of the export partner with Virginia. Japan ranks way up there, China, India, and then, of course, all of our European friends. We've had a strong business and trade relationship with the Atlantic coast for a long time with European nations. But it's exciting because Virginia remains and will be one of the top destinations for import and export because of our great ports. The Virginia Port Authority down there has done a great job in redigging so that we can accommodate the largest and the widest and the deepest ships that are out there. I've done a couple of tours out that way, and it's amazing to see how, and it's one of those things you have to physically visit. And in fact, I would love for our constituents in Northern Virginia and elsewhere to come down and visit your ports in Virginia. It's an amazing thing. State-of-the-art technology. You see these huge machines all operating, picking up these containers, moving them around, and no people. It's all mechanized. So you see people working on the computers, but on the dock, you don't see that many people there. It's all done smoothly. We take care of millions and millions of dollars of trade every single day without any flaws, any problems. And those ships that come in, boy, back when I was growing up, container ships were considered to be big if you could see from one end to the other. You can't see from one end to the other of these ships because they're so huge. And of course, our Newport new shipbuilding is also a place that manufactures our submarines and our aircraft carriers. And so we have some amazing resources out there. We support the ports because it's a great asset for Virginia.
Yeah, the Panama Canal was enlarged, and that allowed these huge ships to come in. And we have a real competitive advantage at that Port of Virginia in terms of the East Coast. And we are still investing monies to maintain that competitive advantage.
Absolutely. And to be more specific, we're competing with Florida, Atlanta, South Carolina, Charleston, and then up here in this mid-Atlantic area, we're competing with Baltimore and with New York, New Jersey. Now, an interesting thing that most people don't think about, because Baltimore is one of the large ports. We drive through there on the way to New York, and you see all the activity. To get to Baltimore, for a ship to get to Baltimore, whether it's coming from the other side of the Panama Canal or from Europe, you have to pass the Port of Virginia first because of the way the Chesapeake is designed. So why would you spend that extra money and time and all the resources to send your ship a few hundred miles more north to get to Baltimore, or maybe 100 miles more, if you can stop in Virginia and unload there? Because if a product is going to go to Ohio, let's say, or to further west from us, something that's unloaded in Baltimore will probably have to come down and hit 64 anyway. So why don't we start right there at the Port of Virginia and shortcut them? So my good friends from Maryland, sorry to say, we're going to try to beat you and eat your lunch.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for being here, Delegate Mark Keam. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you, Woody.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.